Well, hello and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's Newcastle Centre for the Literary Arts and Poetry Book Society showcase event with the poets Raymond Antrobus and Hannah Lowe, a reading I've long been looking forward to. My name is John Chalice and I work at NCLA and Newcastle University. NCLA is proud to host this event in conjunction with the Poetry Book Society, part of a long-running series, and I'll shortly be handing over to Alice Mullen, manager of the Poetry Book Society, who will be introducing Raymond and Hannah. But before I do, I'd just like to draw your attention to the last 3 NCLA events of the year. Next Wednesday at 6:30 p.m, Omar El Akkad will be reading from and in conversation about his highly acclaimed novel, What Strange Paradise, with the journalist and non-fiction author, Andrew Hankinson. Then the following day, on Thursday, 2nd of December, poet and Professor W.N. Herbert will be hosting the final degree show, a celebration of our MA in creative writing and MA writing poetry students. And then lastly, on Wednesday, the 8th of December, novelist Sarah Moss will be reading from her latest book, The Fell, and in conversation with NCLA Director Rachel Hewitt. All of our events are completely free to attend, and you can book your place online at ncl.ac.uk/NCLA. Anyway, now on to this evening's event. So I'm going to hand over to Alice Mullen, who'll be introducing the poets, but then afterwards I'll be back to host a brief Q&A with them after the reading. So if you have any questions at all, please pop them in the YouTube chat and they'll be relayed to us and I will ask them to the poets. So thank you very much. Alice Mullen, over to you.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Poetry Book Society showcase at NCLA. It's my pleasure to introduce our readers tonight, and both of them have just been shortlisted for the Costa Book Awards, so we're really excited to share their poetry with you this evening. The Poetry Book Society is a unique book club founded by T.S. Eliot, and every quarter our expert selectors choose the very best new poetry books to deliver to our members. This week, we're turning Black Friday green and planting a tree for every new member. So please do join us in supporting the poetry ecosystem and giving something back to the planet too. You can find out more about our Green Friday offer on our website, poetrybooks.co.uk. Our first reader tonight is Raymond Antrobus, who was born in Hackney to an English mother and Jamaican father. He is the author of To Sweeten Bitter and The Perseverance, which won the Rathbone Folio Prize, Ted Hughes Award, a PBS Winter Choice, and the Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year Award. All the Names Given is his much anticipated second collection from Picador. These are vulnerable and profoundly searching poems, which move through memory and miscommunication, from Jamaica to America and back again to our most intimate of frailties. Throughout, we find his groundbreaking new caption poems, a formal innovation which captions the silences we all encounter in life, sound of self divided, and turns seemingly passive pauses into the loudest of actions. So I'll hand you over first to Raymond Antrobus to make some noise.
Hello everyone, thank you so much. I'm just going to start my video in 3, 2, 1. Okay, cool. Hello, hi, thank you so much Alice for that introduction. Thank you everyone for tuning in. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're staying safe. I hope you're well fed today. Hello to anyone who is joining us from America. I know it's Thanksgiving and you know, complicated but also a strangely wholesome holiday. Anyway, I'm gonna read some poems from the latest book, All the Names Given, and I hope you enjoyed them. This first poem I'm going to read starts at about the 3rd or 4th poem into the book, and it looks at my surname. And so Antrobus is this name. Like anytime I show up at the UK border, because I leave the country a lot and I come back, and I'm based in a few other countries at the moment. And when I come back into the UK border, 99.9% of the time, they see my passport, they ask about this name Antrobus. And every time I say, you know, they ask, where's it from? And I say it's an English name. And every time it's assumed that it's not an English name. And when I'm there having to make my case that Antrobus is in fact an English name, because it is actually the name of a village in Cheshire. And anyone with that name, because it's a locational name, can be linked to that village in Cheshire. That's where the name began. And I went back to Antrobus village as a kind of, I know, quest, search for a kind of heritage site, homeland of that maybe I could give myself. So I'm just going to share the screen so you could see as well the text. This poem is called Antrobus, Land of Angels. Wherever you are, you touch the bark of trees, different yet familiar. Shezlo Milosh. I can be fiendish. I can't be English, say ghosts. Some with shaved heads, some with cane rows, muttering themselves into notebooks. The barman's eyes and the Antrobus arms become sharp gates when I claim to be English. My mother born here, my grandfather the local preacher. Oh, well then, welcome, he says, or land your angels. There are enigmas in my deafness. I stare at the crest of gold lions behind the bar. I scar the cross of Davidic's line behind the bar. Hear my ghosts say fiendish English. The barman calls the whole village and my name does the rounds. My mother drives us to Antrobus Hall. 2 German shepherds surround the car. I climb out, it's raining, but dogs jump, their paws scraping a new coat of earth on my chest. A farmer appears. Asked if we descended from Edmund Antrobus. Sir Edmund Antrobus, 3rd Baronet, slaver, beloved father, overseer, owner of plantations in Jamaica, British Guyana, and St. Kitts. I shake my head, avoid the farmer's eye. My mother and I tread the cemetery of St. Mark's Antrobus and see everyone buried here is of Antrobus. We look up and see hawks in the ash trees and sparrows in the wheat fields and the rain-soaked stones of Antrobus. And after we walk the slick mirrors of wet roads, the curves of Barber's Lane, between trees, I take a photo of our shadows flung over the red berry bushes like black coats. So it's interesting to me about this name because it's like, again, it's a name that is so anciently English that it's become foreign to itself. And that is a kind of destabilizing concept, or to be in this kind of state of uncertainty of the self, is a tone that persists throughout the whole book of all the names given. I'm going to read now these 2. I'm going to read this one, Plantation Paint. So I found myself, show you this painting. I found myself living in New Orleans, and I thought I was going to be writing this whole book about this village in Cheshire, Antrobus. But the pandemic happened, and I moved to New Orleans just before the pandemic happened with my wife, and she's an art conservator. And so we spend a lot of time in galleries and museums. And so we went to the historic New Orleans collection, and we walked into a museum randomly and saw this painting that I'm showing you now on a huge canvas. It's on its own in this room. And I'm really striking painting, as you can see. And, you know, in Louisiana, Louisiana had one of the most plantations of anywhere per square mile in America. And so I'm looking at this painting, and I look at who painted it, and the painter's name is John Antrobus, painted in 1840, oil on canvas. And so I had this whole kind of moment of this kind of unbelievable coincidence, but I'm finding that with poetry, the longer I write, the less I believe in coincidence, and the more I see how the practice of writing aligns me with something that feels quite mystical in the universe. Anyway, I wrote this poem in response to this painting, and the poem I'm about to read leans on some of the language of Lorna Goodison, former poet laureate of Jamaica, also a painter as well as a poet, and also some of my wife's knowledge about paintings, which she shares in the poem. This is called Plantation Paint.
Ray, sorry, just before you start.
Yes.
The painting wasn't showing up there. I think the screen share was paused.
Oh, Jesus. Okay, sorry, 1 second. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So this is the painting called Plantation Paint. And one of the really interesting things about it, just to say, is that you look in the corner, the two figures, there are three figures, in fact, that are just kind of in the periphery. So right in the background, there's a white couple, and I'm going to assume they are the owners of the plantation. And on the left, you have the man and a white horse as well, and there's all this stuff going on. And yeah, so my wife Tabitha told me this quite mind-blowing thing about. In fact, I'll just read the poem. It's in the poem. So. Hopefully, I can now everyone see the poem. Can people see that, or do I need to stop screen? I need to stop screen again. Okay. Plantation Paint, after Lorna Goodison and Plantation Burial in the Historic New Orleans Collection, 1860, oil on canvas by John Antrobus. Tabitha, the art conservator, squints at the color, tells me the paint depicting the black of these men huddled for a burial will decay before the cypress trees surrounding them will decay. There are several kinds of black, she says, and the cypress trees surrounding them is all I see as we stand alive in this otherwise empty gallery. Why am I like this? What am I like? Who does it matter to? All details question my way of seeing. I worry what kind of black would mark me. I am not the paint made from vine twigs or burnt shells. I am not the lamp full of oil. Tabitha, tell me how you paint me. Tell me if I'm closer to the white painter with my name than I am to the black preacher, his hands wide to the sky, the mahogany wrought of heaven. Sorry, but you know by now that I can't mention trees without every shade of my family appearing and disappearing. Okay, so how much, just making sure that I still have enough time. Am I good on time?
Yep, you're good on time, Raymond.
Okay. So the next poem I'm going to read is called For Tyrone Gibbons, and I wrote it. I mean, I should say that Tyrone was a friend of mine who I went to school with, and he committed suicide a few years ago, and it was such a shock and such a thing that happened to him, and I didn't know if I would ever kind of be able to write about something like this. But what I found happening was I got a commission by Simon Armitage of all people, which was just to respond to one of the Universal Declarations of Human Rights. And so I just had a look at them, and then I just chose one. And one that stuck out to me is number 5, which is, no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. And as soon as I read that, I thought of Tyrone. And also in this poem that I'm about to read, James Baldwin appears. And during the pandemic, a lot of people, had their pandemic reads, catching up. And I realized for a while, I pretended that I had read all of James Baldwin's novels. And I'm sorry, but it wasn't true. I'm coming out with that now. I'd only read 2 of his novels, but during the pandemic, I've now read all of his novels. And what struck me about every one of his novels has at some point a character, usually a Black man, who commits suicide. Every one of his novels. And I'm turning that over in my mind so much. And then it kind of came out in this poem by surprise. For Tyrone Givens, the paper said, putting him in jail without his hearing aids was like putting him in a hole in the ground. There are no hymns for deaf boys, but who can tell we're deaf without speaking to us? Tyrone's name was misspelled in the HMP Pentonville prison system. Once I was handcuffed, shoved into a policeman. I didn't hear the officer say why. I was saved by my friend's mother, who threw herself in the road and refused to let the van drive away. Who could have saved Tyrone? James Baldwin attempted suicide after each of his loves jumped from bridges or overdosed. He killed his characters, made them kill themselves. Rufus, Richard, Black men who couldn't live like this. Tyrone, I won writing awards, bought new hearing aids and heard my name through the walls. I bought a signed Baldwin book. The man who sold it to me didn't know you, me, or Baldwin. I feel I rescued it. I feel failed. Tyrone, the last time I saw you alive, I dropped my pen on the staircase. Didn't hear it fall, but you saw and ran down to get it. Handed it to me before disappearing, said, you might need this. Okay. Have I got time to read 2 more poems?
Yep, sounds great.
Okay. Cool. So this poem, in that same year, I got married, and I was thinking about how I come from a family. My parents never married, basically, and it didn't make any sense to me how I ended up in a marriage. And I was like, I never had like that model to me. And so I was thinking a lot about my parents' relationship, and I was trying to think of a time, because their relationship was very fraught. But I was trying to think of a time when they were, when I looked at them and thought, they love each other. This makes sense. This is the only memory I have that feels true. It's called A Rose, the poem. My father called my mother Rose for short. Once I asked him how it ever worked out between them. The sex, he smirked, the sex was that good. I was 12 and betrayed. But I'd seen him in my mother's garden that summer, growing sunflowers. I'd seen him paint all the walls in her house, and my mother chose the color. I'd seen him bend by my mother's bicycle and mend her tires, rock his head to a record she was playing and ask her if he could borrow it. I'd seen the way he walked down the street, grinning with new music. Once I'd seen him stand behind my mother's market stall when a woman held up a necklace my mother made and asked him how much it was. And he turned to my mother, said, Rose? And he said it like something in him grew towards the light. So I have like a long history of needing therapy and like kind of psychiatric help. And about halfway through the pandemic, I went looking for another therapist because I could see that I was writing a poem, and my practice of poetry is one in which I tried to compartmentalize my own, I suppose, emotional well-being and the practice of writing a book of poems. And what you find, particularly people who may have done talk therapy, and I've done CBT for a long time. I don't do that one anymore. I feel like I've taken enough from that and moved on to other things. But you get a kind of, when you're talking in therapy, you find yourself talking about things that you never even realized was on your mind. And so I came out of this session and I just thought, I'm just going to put all of this stuff that came out into this one poem. I'm going to make an exception for my kind of compartmentalization rule and just throw this in. This poem is called "I Ran Away from Home to See How Long It Would Take My Mother to Notice." Are you my drunk teacher who took our game of rounders way too seriously? Are you the boy who said I had the ugliest smile on the playground? Are you the girl who toe punted my balls and made me a piss sack of blood? The girlfriend who slept with women behind my back said it wasn't cheating? I don't know what I'm saying. Would you be my friend? I spent hours in the house alone as a child. I left fingerprints on my sister's CDs so the music kept skipping. I wanted her friends to be my friends, but I wasn't invited to her parties. Are you the party? Are you my dad lying on the sofa saying I'll soon be dead? When I pull What is Existentialism off my mother's shelf, Simone de Beauvoir says, the movement of my transcendence appears futile. I don't know what that means, so I put it back. Fuck, who loves me? I'm testing everyone. I need space for all my old and new gooey needs and projections. I need constant blaring validation alarms. Give me award ceremonies. Please observe my wall of fame. Best second-guessing overachiever. Best internal monologue while drying dishes. Best self-promoter at the charity fundraiser. Best awkward silence in a moving vehicle. Best bad advice to a couple in crisis. Best non-smoker in the smoking area. Most self-centered fear during the global pandemic. Lifetime Achievement Award for most convincing head nod in a crowded pub. Most triggered person in an empty house. So strange doing this when I can't see anyone. So it literally is a kind of empty house for me. I have no idea how long I've been talking for. That's it, right? I've said enough now.
That was brilliant, Raymond. So powerful.
Okay, cool.
Such a powerful reading. And I can relate to a lot of those. So our next reader tonight is the PBS Autumn Choice, Hannah Lowe. And Hannah was born in Ilford to an English mother and a Jamaican Chinese father. Her first collection, Chick, won the Michael Murphy Memorial Prize and was shortlisted for the Forward, the Fenton Aldeburgh and the Seamus Heaney Centre Awards. The Kids is her third collection, published by Blood Axe, and it's full of empathy and fiercely funny, a sequence of sonnets that takes us back to school in inner city London. Hannah interrogates class, race, gender, the art of teaching, and lifelong learning. And the classroom becomes a microcosm for the tensions of multicultural England, where lessons still need to be learnt today. So I'll hand you over to Hannah, and the rest of the evening will be chaired by the poet John Challis. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Oh, gonna move my screen back a little bit. Yeah, it's a bit weird when you can't see or hear anyone else, but I'm going to presume you're there. And thanks so much for coming tonight, and thank you, Ray, so much for those beautiful poems. And I've been thinking a little bit today about what to read, and I'm going to slightly read differently in a bit of a different order from how I've been reading from this book, which is still like a relatively new experience. But I've been thinking a lot about my parents today, so it's interesting to hear Ray reading his poem Rose. And I've been thinking about their relationship and how kind of integral both of them were to me becoming a teacher. I was looking at this photo earlier, I hope it shows on the screen, of my mum and dad in a jazz club, probably in the late 1960s. They're on the right, my mum at the front and my dad at the back. And by that time, my mum was already a primary school teacher, and my dad was certainly already a professional gambler, as he would say. So I'm going to read a couple of poems about them. I suppose one of the first things you learn, of course, is about your parents. And I was always aware that my dad came from Jamaica, and he came from a place called Yallis. It was like probably one of the very few things I knew about his kind of early life. So I thought I would, hang on, I'm just going to fool around with my screen. I hope this is going to work to share. Can you see the poems? Someone let me know in chat. Yes, great. Okay, great. So I'm going to read this poem about my dad and then work backwards to read some poems about my mum and then education in general. Oh, hang on, I don't want to do that. What have I just done? Bear with me. Okay. The river. Not another poem about my father, as though he's been forever running through me, rising and churning, like the Yallis River where he was born. Sorry. Not another poem about my father, as though he's been forever running through me, rising, churning, like the Yallis River where he was born. That river flooded yearly, so no one could cross. What have I learned after all these years of loss? At poetry readings, I perform him, hope for sighs or laughter. I paint him at casino tables, cooking Chinese suppers, lying in the spare room, dying. I want applause, but see the real man standing at the door. There's something he wants to say, and nothing's been forgiven. Then I hear the water rushing down the corridor. He's swimming hard, but it carries him away. And I'll read a couple about my mum. I would say that I don't read poems about my mum very often. I don't talk about her very often. My mum is both a very, very kind woman, and she can also be cruel. And this is a poem about her. I went to primary school where she was a teacher as well. She bought me a glass of orange squash each morning, and hers was the strong, soothing hand that led me to school and left me skipping or hopscotching in the still dark playground while she drank her coffee in the staff room. Then later, often, I'd see her scolding some nervy, tearful boy in the hall, and I'd repeat in my head, "Is she my mother?" Hearing her voice come down like the clunky heel of a boot, stubbing a beetle out. She is my mother, she is my mother. My mantra when she grabbed our puppy by his collar and dragged him from his bed to crush his snout in whatever bad thing he hadn't meant to do. My mother, she grabbed me by the collar too. My mum was a brilliant pianist, and she loved to play music by Scott Joplin, the kind of ragtime composer from America. So I thought I would read this poem about a song that she loved to play and my childhood like misconception of the name of that song and her name. She had a very unusual name. It wasn't actually a real name. I think it's the name of a flower that her parents had liked. Athena. If I asked, she'd put down her cigarettes or tea towel and sit on the emerald velvet stool. And from her hands, tight knitted hands, the notes fell out like gloves unraveling their wool. She'd play Scott Joplin's waltz, Athena, its title like her name. So I thought that song was hers, its pining melody, a silk scarf fall of crotchets, quavers. That song was in her fingers, like there are songs in mine, though I rarely play, so little time. But today I'm listening to Scott Joplin on my speaker and thinking of the green and glacial drawing room, the way she played those dying phrases, the grace, the pain. Bethany was my mother's given name. I'm going to skip back in the book. Actually, no, sorry, that's a lie. I'm going to skip forward in the book and read a poem that's written for the teacher who really kind of changed my life and inspired me. So I definitely became a teacher because my mum was a teacher. I definitely became a teacher because after my dad died, I wanted to find more meaning in my life. But I also always had in the back of my mind that perhaps I could be for young people aged 16, 17, that was the age I wanted to teach. Perhaps I could be for them what John Toolan had been for me age 16. So I'd gone to this very stuffy traditional secondary school, and actually between you and me, I wasn't allowed into the sixth form because I was so badly behaved. And so off I went to Barking College to do my A-levels, not knowing that I was about to encounter two very radical teachers, actually both called John. And John Toolan taught a very, very unorthodox curriculum and really galvanized my love for literature, and might have galvanized my love for him as well, as you'll hear. John, Pink Hummingbird. The postcard he sent to you that long, wet summer had on one side a pale pink hummingbird, and over leaf his notes on your essay on Faulkner in his usual turquoise ink, the words you imagined written in sunlight on the bed of his booked stuffed flat, each weighed with care like a love letter, though it was you that wanted him. All summer you waited for September, back together in the tattered classroom, the tables pushed together and him at the top, like a doting father or a bridegroom, or like God, if God wore Doc Martens shoes and a silver sleeper in one ear. Not the God you didn't believe in, but one who believed in you. So I'll skip now right to the beginning of the book and read some from the first section, which is all about my early days as a sixth form teacher. And I'll start with the register, which, you know, of course, references Shakespeare because the book is a book of sonnets, and I was often being required as an English teacher to teach the sonnet and to kind of make that form interesting and relevant to kids who maybe didn't think it was very relevant to them. But as any new school year begins, it begins with the register. That first September, I climbed the blue stone steps past Shakespeare's doubtful face, an old mosaic of Jamaica, and the ruby blot of lips where last year's girls had kissed the schoolhouse brick. Now this year's crop pushed past, all clattery chat, their first day back. What's up? Salam. The Fuji's blaring from someone's phone, ready or not. And with that old white dog still barking softly in my head, I walked the sugar-papered hall and pushed the classroom door to find a sprawl of teenagers sat waiting, my re-sitters, all back to do what they'd already failed. I took my seat and called the register. Denise, Tyrone, Alicia, Chantel. Now, as I said, I hoped that I would inspire young people in the way that John Toolan had inspired me, but I can say with great conviction that my first years of teaching, I don't think I was very inspiring. And so the poems in the book that are called The Art of Teaching, the idea of the art is being deployed ironically. So I'll read you a couple of those from towards the beginning. The Art of Teaching 1. Before I'd learnt the art of teaching wasn't to have all eyes on me, but on each other, to unpick a metaphor or draw a poster, or making sure the chat wasn't about their spots or something on EastEnders. I sat behind my desk and talked like a manic newsreader, while their faces balked in boredom or horror and one by one glazed over. But nervousness would keep my mouth turned on like a flooding tap. And as I yacked, the vision of Spud in Trainspotting, who loved a dab of speed and talked the ears off anyone who'd listen, would pop to mind. And all the dabs I'd done myself, more dabs than I'd care to mention. The Art of Teaching 2. Boredom hangs like a low cloud in the classroom. Each page we read is a step up a mountain in gluey boots. Even the clock face is pained, and yes, I'm sure now, ticking slower. If gloom has a sound, it's the voice of Leroy reading Frankenstein aloud. And if we break to talk, I know my questions are feeble sparks that won't ignite my students' barely beating hearts. There is no Volta here, no tan, just more of the same. The clouds sinking ever lower, the air damper, yet more rain, and the task is unchanging, like spending years chasing a monster you yourself created. Leroy asks if you can stop reading. I say, for now, you can. I'll read one for Ray, because he mentioned that he liked it, and I haven't read this one before. And it's about during my years of teaching. So I began teaching, I think, in 2001. And at some point, maybe 5 years later, we moved to a new building, and it was a flash new building. And at that point, all of a sudden, we got electronic screens. So gone out with the blackboard and the chalk and in with the technology. Hang on, I've gone past it. Bear with me. Ooh, here we go. Technology. Suddenly, computers, screens, an electronic pen. So off the cuff, I'd ping a poem up to mercy, pity, peace, and love, or a drawing of the pardoner, an image of an ivory tusk, or a map, one that showed the heyday of the British Empire, the pale blue sea around the places half those kids had sort of come from once, shaded rich and bloody red. I'll just read a couple more poems. I think I'll read one which is about in my years of teaching, you know, I had so many lovely relationships with my teaching colleagues and discussing, you know, issues of pedagogy and different students. But one of the people I spent a lot of time with was a security guard, Vlad, who I used to have a sneaky cigarette with at break time. So this is a poem for Vlad. Bear with me. I'm not as good at the old technology as you, Ray. I can't find my own poems on I think here it is. Ooh. Sonnet for Vlad. Come sun or rain or snow, I smoked with Vlad, the guard from Serbia, on our ashy patch outside the gate. His bear-like body rattled as he puffed. He loved his son so much, the love fell out of him. My Gregor's English perfect, not like mine, he'd say. Oh, to see my boy play football. He shook his head. I wish for him to be professional. They carry such bags of hope, these kids of immigrants. I knew it, teaching them and being half of one myself. My dad would clutch and scan my school report and mouth like prayer the comments. He'd make me play Ravel, Rachmaninoff for his gambling pals, as though he wore my hands. Over my years of teaching, there are many students who I had lovely relationships with, and who I felt, that in the end, maybe I did help out in some way, and that there was a kind of, mutual appreciation. But it's funny what sticks in your head is often the students that were the tricky ones. They're the ones that I've remembered that have stayed with me. And they're the ones that I find myself writing about, perhaps because they're a bit like, a bruise you can't stop yourself from poking in some way. Like even 15 years later, I think of those students who really resisted learning, and the stories they had, the reasons they would be so resistant, what had happened in their families or in their previous education or to them in society. And so I'm going to finish by reading two poems that are sort of paired in the book about one of those students. Janine was a Monday morning queasy feeling. I was never ready for her choice of sting. The late strut in, teeth kissing, rolling eyes, my protests thwacked away like swatted flies, or else the bleat of questions, her pinging hand, a jack-in-the-box, a gun she kept on firing, asking over and over why we couldn't study Harry Potter. Or worse, the searing telescopic stare I winced in as she coiled a lock of hair around the middle finger shone at me. And this went on for months until somebody said the thing and finally brought ease. My dad was half Jamaican, half Chinese. My dad was half Jamaican, half Chinese. Her question at my office door, her face gone softer, searching mine for vestiges of blackness, as if she'd find a sign, a trace, the more she sought. And when I told her yes, was some fire put out? It's hard to know what heat, to presume a heat at all, or guess the stakes when teachers rarely look like those they teach. The whiteness of my skin has been confusion, chaos, agency. Janine was nicer after, oh, what's up, miss, and hey, like neither me nor her remembered Monday's knackering spun out war. She'd dropped her gun. I'd somehow been excused. I'd been forgiven. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Wonderful. That was such two amazing readings, Hannah and Raymond. Thank you so much for them. And thank you so much for sort of your generous discussion of the poems and introductions as well. You know, I feel like we really got an insight to, the thinking behind a lot of these poems as you introduced them and read them as well. So thank you so much. And I was, although you probably couldn't see me because I didn't have the camera on, I'm sure like many in the audience, we were kind of nodding along and smiling and, because there was so much great stuff, and so many great images and great lines and great poems that you both shared. So thank you. So I've got a couple of questions, and then I'm sure we'll have a couple of audience questions as well. And there was something Raymond said during your reading about, the practice of writing becoming more aligned with something mystical and, rather than coincidental. And maybe there's something about, when you're a writer, you become trained almost to see things differently or to spot those moments of coincidences. And this, these are the sort of tangential leaps, but earlier this week, the American poet Robert Bly died. And I was reading his obituary earlier this week, and there was a quote from him which was really interesting. Bly said, I recognize that a single short poem has room for history, music, psychology, religious thought, mood, occult speculation, character, and the events of one's own life. And as I was reading both of your books again, I was thinking, gosh, all of your poems are doing all of these things within one poem. We have history, we have psychology, we have music, we have sound, we have speculation, we have, biography, autobiography. So I kind of wanted to ask you both the same question to begin with about what the role of a poem is for you and what can a poem be? If, like Bly, you were to say what a poem should contain or be, what would that be?
I'm just going to say that it's funny that you're mentioning Robert Bly, because Robert Bly, so well, when I was living in Oklahoma, Robert Bly was also a prolific translator. I happen to be quite obsessed with a number of the poets like Lorca and Juan Jimenez, and Robert Bly was their translator. So I'd actually reached out to Robert Bly and had a very brief email exchange with him about his work, and he also gave me permission to use one of his translations at the beginning of the new book. So his death recently was such, you were talking about like universal or like being aligned or in tune with the universe in some way. Even this kind of loss of Robert Bly. And I think he's one of the most misunderstood people as well, the way it was reported, the way that he's like this kind of men's rights activist kind of thing. It's such a kind of skewed of what he was really writing to. And I think we're now in a political climate which is unfortunately too responsive, too impulsive, to really take the time, I think, to unpack some of Robert Bly's how I take it anyway. And maybe I'm wrong, but sorry. The question was more along the line of like, what is the role of the poem and the function of the poem? I've said this so many times, but like I think every poem we write, for me anyway, is it comes in a different way. It's almost like you know, I talk about how different poems are like different species, because you have to have this some kind of listening or trust of instinct or experimentation. There's an openness that I've needed to hone, I think, in my own process. But so much of that kind of instinct is a trained one, and that comes from reading. That comes from being in conversation with other poets. Hannah was one of my mentors before I'd even published anything. So, you know, even this conversation for me is a kind of attempt or giving back to, you know, the time that I've spent with poetry. Yeah.
Thanks, Ray. Thank you.
Oh, I don't think I can put it any better than Robert Bly has put it, you know, in a way. But and I agree with Ray that, you know, each poem is a different species. Like a poem can be so many things. It can be an act of testifying. It can be a plea or a prayer. It can be a reflection. You know, for me in my work up until the kids, I think poetry has often been all the things I haven't been able to say otherwise in my normal life. You know, if I'd been on a therapist's couch as a teenager, I don't think I'd be writing poetry, to be honest. But also, I mean that in a more serious way without being glib. You know, the loss of my father when I was young and all that had gone unsaid between us, I think I've been trying to fill that space ever since with poetry. And in the kids, I mean, my dad is still there and my mum, as you could hear very strongly. I'm conversing with them, but I'm also testifying to my experiences. But particularly in this book, the poems, whether or not they sounded like it, they're meant to be love poems. That's why the sonnet was the right form for the book. To my teachers, to my parents, to my teenage students, to my teenage friends. I think a lot of what Bly is talking about, because you're working on the poem, it's like, how could the poem do so much when it's such a compressed form? But I think that's why each word has to be so delicately weighed. And then hopefully a lot of what Bly was referencing, the universal, the autobiographical, the philosophical, that's all happening in the white space. Yeah, like it's the ricochet effect or the echo effect for gentler language that could be happening in the white space around the poem. But I think there is no singular answer to your question, John, but it makes me want to go and look up what Robert Bly said.
I'm glad there's no singular answer, and I'm glad, you know, both wonderful answers. It's always interesting just to hear how, you know, what poets think about this poem, what the poem can do, and you both rightly answer. I think that, you know, that there isn't an answer. It can be many things. It can contain multitudes. We've got a couple of audience questions, and I feel like I've got a question I want to come back to, but I feel like we should probably ask a couple of the audience questions quickly. There's Laura Kasongo has asked, but firstly she says amazing readings, but she said, as a young poet myself, I wanted to ask you how you've both been able to develop a sense of consistent, unique voice for your collections. So maybe you could both speak a little bit about voice, I suppose, developing a voice through your writing from book to book.
Yeah, I can say something that when I first started writing, and I came to poetry quite late in my life, like late 20s, I didn't have a singular voice. I'm not sure I've got a singular voice now, but I know that I started to think about voice and trying on different voices through reading. I mean, I was so enthusiastic when I found poetry. I knew nothing about contemporary poetry whatsoever, and I was just buying collection after collection after collection, or getting them out of libraries, and then I was trying to emulate those poems. So I would try and write a bit just like Charles Simic for a bit, which is bizarre because he's like, I'm definitely like in the realist mode and he's a surrealist, but I was trying to write surreal poems about my shoes talking to me. Then I was trying like Philip Levine on for a bit, and I was borrowing little bits that I liked from what Levine did. I loved his long, languorous lines, but I also loved the things when he said like, "This is Detroit, 1941," and I would be like, "This is Ilford, Essex, 1996." So I was borrowing. And somehow I think through that process of emulation and modeling, something of my own voice started to come through. And of course, that's linked to my own Essex vernacular, to the particular slang that informed my my upbringing. But then, of course, in the latest book, I was trying to be really in tune with the way the kids spoke as well. So embarrassing as it is, there is quite a bit of multicultural London English, as they call it, strung through the book. But I don't know that beyond what I've said about parroting and borrowing and emulation, I have a sense that I couldn't write any other way than how I do write. And that is my voice. Like I couldn't write like Ray, for example, or you, John, and I suspect you probably couldn't write like each other or me either. That you settle into something. It doesn't mean you don't develop over collections, but you settle into something and that's your voice. But it's after a lot of practice, I think.
Yeah, I agree with everything Hannah said there. But also this whole thing about writing like someone, like poetry as a tradition is deep, and it is very thinking about the time, the breadth, the tradition of like how many poets have been writing, even dating the Bible, one of our holiest, most well-known texts. I think I like to think of the Bible as probably the book with the best PR in the world. But like, it's not about, I think, writing like someone necessarily. I think you can write with someone. So something that I did throughout All the Names Given is I lifted lines from the poets that were kind of invigorating me as I was reading them, as I was writing. I would go back to poets like Adrienne Rich, Cameron Braithwaite, John Keats, James Berry, and I was able to find ways to, speak with them as well as through them. And all of those lines are kind of acknowledged as well throughout the book. So that's what I feel is one of the real great feats, I suppose, of kind of writing poetry and developing, your taste and your style in it. It doesn't have to be this kind of lonely, solitary thing where you sit at your desk and come up with all of these kind of grand illusions and visions, when you have literally thousands and thousands and thousands of years that we can stand on. So it's so interesting as well, like Hannah's poem, and she's standing on the shoulders of the great bard, but actually I think there's so much in the kids that is really disarming and complicates or subverts some of the ideas of Shakespeare. I think it's a great, wonderful, readable, I should say, and relevant book. And in that way, when I first, I read, I don't know, okay, yeah, I'm going to share this. I read Hannah Lowe's book, first book, Chan.
Chick.
Sorry, wow, it's late. Sorry, I've got a baby up in the ladder.
You've got a 10-week-old baby.
Yeah.
Everyone wants to buy Hannah's first book.
Yeah,
It's
my
available.
brain is gone.
Yeah.
And no, I read Hannah's poems before I met her, and I was so moved by the voice, and I was so moved by the references, and I couldn't quite believe that this voice existed, because I hadn't yet come across a register, an experience like, you know, mixed race, working class background, Jamaican dad, alcoholic, like gambler in a way. Alcohol is a bit of a thing. Like there was so many crossovers in our upbringing, that, you know, I found such, I want to say affirmation, but I also want to say permission in it. So not being afraid to align yourselves with the voices that give you permission, I think is something I would have told my younger self, something that I did anyway, but I would have probably done it sooner. So I needed to be exposed in a way to poets who shared some, you know, that I related to, basically, as well as a lot of poets that I don't. I mean, I love Rumi and Hafiz, and I'm not well versed in the Quran in the 4th century yet. I, for some reason, hugely resonate. So it's not just limited to your own experiences, but it's a good way in. I hope that that's an answer.
Yeah, no, there's brilliant answers to both of you, and I think, you know, there's great advice in all of those answers to read widely, but also read the things that excite you, and you know, and I love what both of you are saying about how you know, Raymond, you're talking about how you're involving other poets as a kind of collaboration, a conversation. And interestingly, Adrian Rich appears in both of your books in different ways, and which is really wonderful. And I love what you're saying, Hannah, about how you tried to sort of imitate those voices, but by doing that, those voices become you, and, you know, there's a kind of Venn diagram going on, you know, Levine, you know, whoever else, and then Lowe is in the center, but then the Lowe one gets bigger and bigger, and becomes the kids, which is, you know, an amazing, you know, it's just an amazing book. As you know, all of your 3 books, Chick and Chan, you know, and one thing we haven't spoke about is obviously both of your inventiveness with form. I mean, and Hannah's second book, for those of you who haven't read it, Chan has got some amazing kind of borderline poems where half of the poem is in bold and half the poem isn't, and there's almost like 3 poems in one. Anyway, I'm going off topic now. You should all read that. But one last question I had for both of you, and this ties in, I think, with some of the questions the audience have been asking for, about the books, really, about how do you put a book together. Raymond, in your book, you've got these kind of wonderful closed captions threaded throughout that kind of almost sonic textures to the book, but they also kind of conjure images, and they reflect the kind of closed captions you see, you know, hopefully some of you are seeing on YouTube right now as we're all speaking. Hannah, it's all sonnets, although there's one poem that's like 5 or 6 sonnets in one. At what point did these forms come to you? Was it through the act of writing? Was it through the drafting? Or did you set out to write these books with ideas in mind?
You want to go, Ray?
Well, yeah, I could say that straight up, no, I had no idea. I thought I was writing a particular kind of book, and it became something very different. I know that it looks kind of easy. Like, people talk about how poetry books, you know, typically they're quite short. You can read them in an hour. But I definitely think we spend as much time on them as novelists do on their books, because you have to write the equivalent of 3, 4, 5 books before you like whittle it down and narrow the vision of it. So I don't write poetry collections. None of my books are collections. My books are books in that sense. In the sense that I don't feel like in isolation, the poems are kind of, you know, they can't do or say what the entire book does, you know, that, and the idea of putting the kind of captions in, I hoped, assisted with a kind of immersion. So in the Perseverance, I relied a lot on sequence to create immersion. In this book, I'm relying on captions to create immersion and a few other things as well. But every book I write also has 3 different versions to it. So there's the printed, obviously the book is one thing, and then the audio version is another version, which is slightly different to the book as well. And then the live version, I work with a few friends of mine who are British Sign Language interpreters and speak with them, and they also have their own version of how to sign the poems and how to create transitions between the poems. So transitions between moments within the poem and within poems is something I think a lot about in no matter whatever format I'm in. And I found this, Hannah was talking earlier about white space in poetry, and how you need to try and make the white space meaningful despite its blankness. And I found a way through captioning and a few other things, but mainly captioning, to animate white space. And so many poems, metaphysical poets have been doing this for centuries. I'm not claiming to have completely invented something new. I feel like it's added to, as well as looking at artists in other art forms. So the work of the deaf sound artist Christine Sun Kim has been elemental to my thinking in deafness and poetry, and negotiating a relationship with sound, and having me really think through what kind of relationship I want to have with sound, but also with the readers and also with books I publish, especially when up to 70% of people born profoundly deaf, in the UK are illiterate. So I'm often thinking about ways to speak in spite of, and so the forms which I tend to gravitate towards play or lean into that. So for example, even in the Perseverances, most of the forms that I use are all repetition, and I realized how much repetition is, being hard of hearing or deaf, always asking people to repeat themselves. The books I loved as a child often had a kind of repetition as a structure in them. And I realized this kind of, Hannah was also talking about the relationship between like the poem and the prayer, and how many prayers have repetitions in them, how many songs have repetitions in them. There's something very powerful about that as an art form, but this book as a mode. But this is like the kind of power, isn't it, of poetry. I'm always overwhelmed by the potential for it, but also by, again, what is all the tradition of it, and how much, how just how much is available to us. And like poetry really does overwhelm me. That's why I can't even read it or think about it after a certain time, because I won't get to sleep.
Well, I was thinking that, both Ray and I have got obvious interest in forms, and I noticed that right from when I first saw your writing, Ray, that you had an interest in form. And I was thinking about structures of repetition, like in some of the books, the poems in the Perseverance, like the pantoum structure, those sorts of repeated refrains and everything. But how your work has basically that idea, which sounds really pedestrian, about the matching of form and content, how like you've really taken that and run with it, because there's so many formal choices and formal things that you've done, it's really inventively, that are about thinking through sound and silence, and it's a beautiful matching very creatively of form and content. For me, I think form comes from a slightly more scaredy cat place, which is where like free verse for me is like diving into the Pacific, right? Whereas I like a swimming pool with lanes and rules and a lifeguard, and that is what the sonnet is for me. So I like what the form does. How the kids came about was me recognizing after a while that I had, I wanted to write about my life as a teacher, because I'd left teaching. I mean, I'd only moved to university, but it was very different. And I was reflecting on how much those kids had taught me. And I just started sketching out a couple of sonnets. Then I had about 5. Then I thought to myself, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to write a series of interlinked sonnets where the first, like a crown, but an extended crown, where the last line is the first line of the next sonnet. Now, why I thought that was a good idea, I do not know. I was about 35 poems into that when I realized it did not work. And it was very, very painful to realize that that was not going to work. And I had to step away, and I had to really look away for months, actually. But what I was doing, I don't know if this will chime with Ray, is like, I realize now that wasn't wasted, because I was doing the scaffolding. So even though you might say the sonnet itself is the scaffold, actually it was that interlinking line and all the ways it forced me into different rhymes and different patterns, metrical patterns. That was the scaffolding. And then I kicked it out into what by then was a bit easier, which was the single sonnet. And once you've written 35 sonnets, there is a bit of a thing like, why would I stop now? And it was a bit like that with the borderliners, actually, in Chan. I mean, for a while, I couldn't see why one poem shouldn't be made bold and have another one mashed onto it. It took me months to get over that as well. So I can't write now because I can only write sonnets, but I suspect in about a year, I'll be able to not write sonnets. But I do think there's something about the matching of form and content. As I already said, I wanted to write love poems, essentially, but not traditional, like, how do I love thee, let me count the ways kind of sonnets. I wanted to write about the love that I had felt for all kinds of people that maybe I didn't express at the time. And again, that comes back to the first question about the poem being the secret whispered in the ear, the thing you can't say. You can't bring yourself to say it, or you don't know that you should say it at the time, so you say it later. And I often think my poems are like that. They're sort of, they're the things I would like to whisper into people's ears if I had the opportunity. Could I just say something else? One last thing on the point of like mine and Ray's love for each other, was that poetry is actually the way that I found my tribe, because even though it might have seemed to you, Ray, that I was the first, like one of the first people that was talking about having a Jamaican father and all those, the experience of growing up in London and everything, I didn't know anyone else like me until I started writing poetry. And now I know quite a few people like me, as I'm sure you do. And so poetry has really been a place of coming home and finding a like community, but in the really sort of strongest sense of what community can mean. So I just wanted to add that in.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. I mean, Seamus Heaney, he's got that line, isn't he? He says something like, poetry is the sound of your tribe. Yeah. Brilliant.
It's definitely where I found my tribe.
Oh, guys, that's wonderful. There are so many tangential points to take on there, but I think we're going to have to wrap up now because we've kind of overshot the time. But I'm sure that's not been a problem for anyone, because that was wonderful, and thank you for your generous answers. And what a wonderful way to end. Welcome to your tribe, everyone, and
go on in.
So I just want to say thanks to a few people. Thank you, Alice Mullen, for your wonderful introductions this evening. And thank you for the Poetry Book Society for hosting this event with NCLA. Thank you to Peter Hebden, who has been doing all the technical stuff behind the scenes. And thank you to Melanie Birch, who organises the events so brilliantly and promotes them as well. So thank you again to the audience as well for attending. But thank you most of all to Hannah Lowe and Raymond Antrobus for their wonderful readings. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, and thanks, John, for your lovely hosting as well.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Peter. Have a great evening. Yes.
Bye.